slides, right? So just give me a second. Okay.
Okay.
So hi everyone. Today we have with us Joel Minden. He is a clinical psychologist specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety and related disorders. He's also the author of Show Your Anxiety, Who's the Boss, as well as the director of Chico Center for Cognitive Behavior Therapy. Further, he's also an adjunct faculty at California State University in Chico. Thank you for joining us today, Joel. And,
Thank you.
So Joel will be talking to us today about the significance of working through difficult emotions. So the broad structure of our session is that Joel would be presenting his views for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll be following it up with 35 to 40 minutes of question answer session. You can also post your questions on the chat box while the talk happens, and I'll definitely call upon you during the question and answer session. You can also raise your hand during the QA session to ask the question. So before I turn over the virtual floor to Joel, I would like to request everyone to mute their microphones. We do encourage you to start your camera if that suits your setup. So thank you. Over to you, Joel.
Okay, Sahana, thank you. So I can go ahead and load the slides. Okay. There we go.
Yes, great. That's wonderful. We can see it. It's perfect.
Okay, so let's see. There we go. Better?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Bear with me a little bit. I'm getting used to the format of this this presentation software, but she'll get into the swing of things quickly. So my name is Joel Minden, and I'm a clinical psychologist, as you just heard, and I specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy, primarily for anxiety disorders, but all kinds of emotional disturbances, mood disorders like major depression. I also work with folks who struggle with anger. And so I think, the topic that I want to address tonight is, or today for most of you, it's about dealing with very difficult emotions. And I think we all experience challenging emotional experiences like anxiety and sadness or depression and anger. And it's very difficult to know what to do with those emotions. And I think often we run into difficulties where we let our difficult emotions drive behavior. And sometimes that can create a lot of problems. One of the things I want to talk about today is the problem of avoidance. And so sometimes the things that we do to try to cope with difficult emotions can create a lot of problems, even though it might seem reasonable enough in those moments when we're struggling emotionally, because we might do certain things where we avoid situations that are really important because we don't know that we're going to be able to cope, or we won't be able to tolerate some of the difficult emotions that will come up. Or we might try to avoid the thoughts that are related to difficult emotions, or we try to avoid the emotions themselves with various coping strategies. And I think long term, it's really important for all of us to find productive ways to work through difficult emotions so that ultimately we can really prioritize action, we can prioritize living our lives, we can make choices on our own terms without worrying so much about the emotional challenges that we face, and without letting emotions drive what we do. So that's the focus of my talk. So action, not avoidance, the mental health benefits of working through difficult emotions. So, I'll talk more about this issue of, difficult emotions and avoidance. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's the type of psychotherapy that I practice, or that I specialize in. And even though perhaps for a lot of you, you may not be struggling with significant emotional disturbances or patterns of behavior that you consider to be dysfunctional, I think, even if we're talking about folks who are dealing with subclinical issues, just challenging emotions from time to time, I think even then, some of the concepts that we can take from cognitive behavioral therapy are going to be really useful, hopefully for all of you, I think, in daily life. And these are concepts that I think about a lot in my own life, and I find them really helpful, in working with folks with a variety of concerns. So hopefully you'll find them useful too. So CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, There are really three things that I think are important to consider here, and we really try to simplify the process of understanding the human experience. And so in cognitive behavioral therapy, we're going to look at three types of experiences. And so one would be, let's see if I can, there we go. One would be cognition, right? So as the name cognitive behavioral therapy would suggest, cognition, the cognitive element or the prong would refer to how we think or what we think, so the content of our thoughts. And so here we're looking at beliefs and attitudes and assumptions. It's what we think. So very interested in these cognitive processes. This is really important for understanding not just what we think or how we think, but also for understanding why we experience certain difficult emotions and why we might struggle with our behavior as well. By the way, just as an aside, I want to mention that maybe you've noticed I have a little guest joining me. That's my cat. And the issue is either I let him in the room and he'll run around and do his thing and it won't bother us too much, or I keep the door closed and he makes a lot of noise and we'll be aware of him much more. So hopefully that's okay with all of you that he's running around as I do the talk today. All right, so one element of CBT is the cognitive prong or the cognitive element. And then another would be emotional. So I think we're all pretty aware of the difficult emotions we might experience. So how do we feel? I think that's pretty straightforward. And then finally, in CBT, we think about behavior, the behavioral element of the human experience, and that's what we do. And so when we're thinking about CBT, we want to look at the interplay. How do all of these elements relate? So let's say, for example, if we're kind of thinking about application of these concepts. So most of you are students, those of you who are viewing this right now. And so if you're a student, let's say, for example, you have an upcoming project or an exam or something like that, and you might anticipate this upcoming challenge, and you might think, I'm not prepared for this. I'm not going to do well. It's going to be really difficult. And if you have these future-oriented concerns, if you have these beliefs about the future that something's going to be bad and you won't be able to cope, you won't be able to handle it, then you're probably going to have an emotional reaction, and it's probably going to be anxiety. Because whenever we have this belief that something bad will happen in the future, our bodies prepare us to take action in some sort of way, either to defend ourselves, to protect, or play it safe in some way. So collectively, when we have those experiences that are often, I guess the most noticeable experiences that we have are physical, we might look at all of that along with the thoughts, the predictions that something bad will happen, and we describe that emotion as anxiety. So we predict the bad event, we have the emotional response of anxiety, and then, of course, the behavioral response that might follow is often avoidance. So if we think something bad will happen, we feel anxious, we might avoid the situation that's anxiety provoking. And so that might result in procrastination, not doing the work, not engaging in the process of completing a project. And then, of course, that might provide a little bit of temporary relief from the anxiety, but ultimately that project is still there. We have to get to it. We have to face it at a certain point. So that's not really a good tactic, but I think it's pretty relatable, probably something that most or all of us have experienced. Of course, one last thing I want to say about this is when we see that avoidant behavioral pattern, that might influence our thinking as well. And so again, we can think about that interplay. So if you don't do the work, then you might start to have different thoughts like, this is hopeless. I'm not going to be able to, get through school. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. And these are the kinds of thoughts that are, sort of linked to concerns about loss of effectiveness or hopelessness. And those are the kinds of concerns or ideas that might result in sadness or depression. So hopefully you can kind of see how all of these processes are related. And in my experience, I think what happens for a lot of people is they focus so much on the emotional aspect of different challenges that they encounter in life. And so let's say somebody's feeling anxious or depressed, they're probably going to work really hard to control the emotions. And I think sort of counterintuitive, but we're generally not very good at controlling our emotions. And so the more effort we put into trying to calm down or trying to, be motivated or energized or whatever it is we're going for emotionally, the more we might find that we're not very good at doing that. And that can lead to more beliefs about our ineffectiveness, more behavioral avoidance or passivity. So instead of focusing so much on trying to manage or control emotions, we have a little more room for movement, greater capacity for growth and change if we focus more on cognition, what we think, and behavior, what we do. Okay, so that's an overview of CBT. Now, CBT and difficult emotions, let's think about some themes that come up when we talk about certain emotional experiences that people have. So as I just mentioned, when we feel sad or depressed, that often comes with beliefs, certain thoughts about loss. And I think, we can all understand, the sadness that comes with loss. For example, if you lose a job or you lose a loved one, or, you lose something really significant in your life, then of course you're going to go through a period where you're feeling sad or down or depressed. But sometimes the loss beliefs are more about things like, I've lost motivation, I've lost effectiveness, I've lost interest. And so that can lead to sadness. Also hopelessness. So when we have these beliefs that there's nothing we can do to change our experience, that things will never get better, that we're stuck and we're just destined to be uncomfortable or dysfunctional, that's another type of thinking that can lead to sadness or depression. And then behaviorally, when we feel this way, that often leads to passivity, so not doing a whole lot. We see a big decline in activity overall, and then withdrawal, perhaps pulling away from activities that we might normally enjoy or find meaningful. So, for example, when people get depressed, they might withdraw from social activity because, again, the loss and hopelessness, I'm not good at it, I won't be effective, it's not going to go well, I'm not going to get much out of it, and so they pull away. Okay, so that's one way of sort of looking at emotions, thoughts, and behaviors collectively. And then when we talk about anxiety, as I mentioned earlier, anxiety is the emotion. And why do we feel anxious? It's because we make a prediction about the future. It's a future-oriented emotion, and we might identify a potential threat. Something bad's going to happen. So we get anxious, right? It's a lot like fear. We're really preparing ourselves to deal with that challenge or that threat. And then, of course, when we feel anxious, often the pattern of behavior that we see is avoidance, really trying to distance ourselves from whatever it is that has perhaps contributed to anxiety in the first place. Then finally, when we talk about anger, and of course, there are many other difficult emotions, but these are the three I want to focus on today, just in the interest of time. But when we talk about anger, often when people get angry, it's because they believe that others are being disrespectful to them, that they're not showing regard for their rights, that they're being treated unfairly. And so when we believe this, if we think that these are the things that are happening in our lives, then we might become quite angry. And behaviorally, that can lead to outbursts, exploding, yelling at people, or perhaps aggression, physical aggression, which of course we want to minimize or avoid entirely. So these are examples of the cognitive and behavioral aspects of difficult emotions. So avoidance, right? We don't want to deal with these things. They're really uncomfortable emotions. And so we sometimes get really creative in the tactics that we turn to try to protect ourselves or distance ourselves from these emotions. So sometimes we avoid situations, and that's pretty clear cut. I think most of us recognize that, if we're feeling a certain way, or if we think we might feel a certain way, perhaps it's best to stay away from a situation that could provoke that. Let's take anger, for example. If you have to, let's say there's tension in a relationship, you're dealing with conflict, you might say, well, I'm going to avoid interacting with this person because, it's just going to make the problem worse. There's going to be more conflict. I'm not going to be able to resolve the issue with them. So maybe it's better for me to stay away. We might try to avoid our thoughts. We don't want to think about unpleasant thoughts. So maybe we do creative things to distance ourselves from cognition. And then we might try to avoid the emotions. And we'll talk more about the things that we do to make that happen. So some examples of avoidance, and you know, I kind of use this term avoidance. I think a lot of people would say avoidance is really, you know, something that we see primarily with anxiety, but I kind of think as avoidance as anything that we might do to try to reduce the impact of an emotion or distance ourselves from an emotion. So but I think anxiety is always a great example when we're trying to understand what avoidance is. Sometimes it's really clear-cut behavioral avoidance. And so here we might have this belief, I can't do it. So that might result in something like refusal. Some people get anxious when they drive or when they get on a plane, when they're flying. Some people might be anxious when it comes to schoolwork, so they don't go to school or they don't do the work. And some people might be anxious about social activities, so they avoid those. Procrastination, so putting off important responsibilities. And that might be school assignments or work projects or answering emails, things like that. These are, you know, really clear-cut examples of behavioral tactics that we use to get away from uncomfortable situations. Now, cognitive avoidance, that's sometimes subtle. And with cognitive avoidance, right, it's sort of the belief that I can't think it. I don't want to have these thoughts. And sometimes the things we do might involve strategies like so-called positive thinking. Now, I talk to a lot of people who say, I know that my thinking is overly negative, that I'm irrational, that it's illogical, that the stuff that pops into my mind, I don't know if I really believe it. And so I try to think positive. This is something I hear a lot from people. The problem with so-called positive thinking is just like overly negative thinking can be biased, it can be irrational, it can be distorted. We can run into that problem as well with positive thinking. It's biased, it's excessive. So think about the things that we kind of tell ourselves when we're trying to be positive in our thinking, like everything's going to be great, right? And we don't know that. We don't know that. We can't predict the future. We don't know for sure that things will work out. Or, you know, if we think bad things about ourselves, like I'm a failure, and then we try to counteract that with, no, that's not true, right? I'm doing great things, and we may not believe that either. So we've got to be careful about the positive thinking. I think if we go back and forth between overly negative and overly positive thinking, it just results in this internal struggle. We don't believe either set of thoughts entirely. And so, you know, this just creates this internal battle that I don't think is useful at all. So we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about other ways of thinking that can be more helpful. Sometimes critical self-talk. So we might have negative thoughts and then we're tough on ourselves. Stop thinking about that. You know, get this off your mind. Just get it out of your head. And that doesn't work, right? The more we tell ourselves not to think about certain things, the more likely it is that we're going to think about those things. So instead of beating ourselves up over thoughts we don't like, sometimes it's helpful to acknowledge that, you know, sometimes I just think that way. I don't really have a lot of control over this. Perhaps I do this because I've learned to do it. It's more of a conditioned response. It's a pattern of thinking that I've acquired over time through experience. Maybe I don't have to take it so seriously, right? And that takes some practice, but you know, instead of being really tough on ourselves because we have these undesired thoughts, sometimes really helpful to be patient, kind, accepting, and acknowledge that, yeah, those thoughts are just going to come up and that's okay. Other things we might do, we try to distract ourselves from the thoughts. Let me get away from it. I'll do something else. I don't have to think about it. And then finally, avoidance of emotions, the things that we do not to feel certain things. And as you see, I have here emotional/physical sensation avoidance. And so, you know, sometimes, right, we kind of look at what our bodies are doing, right? If your heart's beating really fast, you might say, oh, okay, I'm anxious. So I think they go together. The way we understand whether we're experiencing an emotion or the intensity of the emotion is sometimes we use the data from what we observe in our bodies, and then we make that judgment that this is the emotion. So the belief would be, I can't feel it. I can't have this type of emotion. So sometimes people turn to things that they think are very healthy, and you know, these are healthy things, right? So you know, if I'm feeling really overwhelmed emotionally, maybe I'll exercise, right? Maybe that'll help me blow off some steam, I can relax, I can unwind, I'll feel better. Seems reasonable enough. Or controlled breathing. I hear this a lot. I'm anxious, so let me do some breathing exercises. It'll help me calm down, or meditation. So all of these things are, I don't want to send the message that you shouldn't do these things. These are wonderful activities, wonderful practices. But for managing emotions, the effect is inconsistent. It's temporary. And ultimately, right, whatever led to the emotional response in the first place, it's not going away. So if you've got some challenge in front of you, you've got some sort of problem and you're getting emotional because of it, all of these tactics are just going to give you a little bit of relief. It's temporary, but it really doesn't address the foundation or foundations of the problem. So I think this stuff is fine, but I think it's really incomplete, and unfortunately, sometimes people become really dependent on these strategies that don't always work. I guess a final point is sometimes these things aren't practical. Let's say you're at a work meeting and you're so used to dealing with stress, with anxiety, let's say by exercising, you can't just leave the meeting and go work out. It's not a practical option. So we need to find ways to work through these emotions because sometimes they're just going to be there. Some people turn to medication, they take prescription meds, and so certainly that's a choice, that's an option. And then some people do more destructive things like relying heavily on drugs and alcohol. And something I hear a lot when people have social anxieties, they say, I have a drink or two, it helps me relax, I feel more comfortable with people. But of course, that can turn into an excessive pattern of use where people are relying too heavily on alcohol or other recreational drugs, and so we want to minimize that as well. Okay, so that's avoidance. We want to, first of all, I think when we're, kind of approaching difficult emotions from a different perspective, one of the things that I find really helpful is start paying more attention to how you think. And as I said before, most of us are really good about noticing our emotions. Those are so observable, they're so apparent. But I think a lot of people struggle when it comes to understanding how they think. And so when we have difficult or intense emotions, especially emotions that are so challenging that they create significant distress in life or lead to dysfunction, often this happens repeatedly because we get stuck on certain ways of thinking. And in cognitive therapy, we might call them cognitive distortions. Some people would say thinking traps, which I think is a little more user-friendly, because it is like we're getting stuck on these beliefs that maybe are biased, they're distorted, they're just not quite accurate. So we want to be aware of the thinking traps that pop up for us. And there's so many of them, but I just want to point out a few that might be useful for those of you watching to be aware of. One is all or nothing thinking. And here's where we're kind of taking our experiences, the way we understand ourselves or other people or the future. We kind of think about things in sort of a dichotomous way in these categories that are either it's this thing or it's that thing. It can't be anything in between. So some examples would be, statements like or beliefs like, I can't do this job. Think about the issues that come up with, or that come up if you think that way. I can't do this job. If you really believe that, either I can or I can't, if you believe you can't, then you've already made up your mind, right? I'm not going to be able to do it. I shouldn't even try. And you're probably going to feel, depressed or something like that, and then behaviorally be really passive. So it's so limiting when you get stuck on these rigid beliefs, these ideas that are, they're inflexible, they're categorical in this way, all or nothing. It really limits your opportunities for emotional responding, for behavior change, and for growth and movement. So we want to be careful about thinking in these terms. Another is I'm a failure, right? I'm a success or I'm a failure. And so let's say somebody is, things are going pretty well, and then they have a couple setbacks. They might say, yep, I'm a failure. Which, is probably not a very realistic belief, but when we're not feeling good, sometimes we really do get stuck on these ideas that aren't quite accurate. Or thinking about another person, you don't care about me. Either you do or you don't, right? And so if you think you don't, then how is the other person supposed to maneuver, right, if you're really invested in that belief? So lots of pitfalls here. Got to be careful about those all or nothing ways of thinking. Another type of thought trap or thinking trap we want to be careful about is catastrophizing. And here's where, with anxiety, we might start to have certain beliefs about the future. We think the future is going to be catastrophic in some way. So let's say you're taking a class and you get a bad grade on something, you might make the prediction, I'm going to fail the class, right? That would be the worst possible outcome. That may happen, it may not, but if you're so locked into the worst thing that'll happen, again, it really makes it hard to maneuver. And so you might have intense anxiety and you might think, I better just drop the class. I better avoid anything that's, going to make me feel uncomfortable or lead to this catastrophic outcome. Let's say you notice your heart's beating fast. I have heart disease, right? Well, that would be a bad outcome. But again, probably overstating the likelihood that something really, really bad is going to happen, maybe not considering the possibility that, something else is going on, that maybe it's not a big deal. So really getting stuck on that worst case scenario is what we see with catastrophizing. Or if you're, let's say you're not thinking clearly one day, you're having trouble getting your thoughts together, or just mentally, or you're struggling with memory or whatever. Maybe life is stressful at the time, who knows, but you might think I'm going crazy. Again, kind of a worst case scenario. We got to be careful about that. It's really going to exacerbate anxiety and probably create more avoidance. Overgeneralization is where we might look at a little bit of information. We might have a little bit of data from our experiences in life and use a small bit of information, a few experiences, and then kind of generalize that information to our entire lives. It leads to this, it's sort of this global universal thinking. One way to detect overgeneralization is when we use language like always, never, everybody, nobody, nothing. So I'm always messing up, right? Probably not true, right? I mess up sometimes, it's more than I would like to. I mess up in certain areas of my life, not always, not in every situation. Everything is boring. I hear this a lot when people are depressed. Everything is boring. Well, that makes it really tough, right? To get out of a depressed state if you really believe that. So another belief might be something like, a lot of things that I think about seem boring. Maybe if I try to do some of the things I've enjoyed in the past, maybe I'll enjoy them and it's worth it to try, right? So that seems pretty realistic. Nobody listens to me, right? Understandable that somebody would be pretty angry or pretty frustrated if they really believe that nobody's listening. So hopefully you get the point, right? All of these are very rigid ways of thinking. They really get in our way if we get stuck on these ideas. And so we want to give ourselves an opportunity to think in different ways that are going to be more useful for us long term. By the way, I just want to say these thinking traps, we all do it, right? We all get stuck on these ideas and, and so be patient with yourself, understand that you're going to do it. It's a very efficient way of thinking, right? Either I'm good or I'm bad, right? It's always like this. It's an easy way of thinking. We do it because it's efficient, but I think if we're aware of it, that gives us an opportunity to respond to it in helpful ways. So avoidance, right? Kind of the greatest hits of avoidance. These are the thoughts that come up so much for people when they do struggle with avoidance. So we'll look at kind of a belief on one side and then a helpful comeback on the other side. Let's say you have, I hear this one a lot, I'll do it, right? Something important, right? I have this important thing to do. I'll do it when I'm feeling better, right? Like we're waiting for that magic moment where everything feels so good that we can finally tackle a difficult project. Come back to that might be, I can work through the difficult emotions. I don't need to wait until I'm feeling better. I can try to do it now, or I can do it anyway, even if I'm not feeling 100%. I have to calm down first, right? Another comeback to that might be, I don't have to. I can tolerate the discomfort and, I'll see how it goes. I just want to get rid of this feeling, right? Of course, right? But a comeback might be, well, it's okay to have feelings. You may not like it. Maybe you don't want to feel that way, but you have it. It's there in front of you. It's something you're dealing with, and that's okay. It's okay to have an emotional reaction. I can't concentrate, function, or cope, right? The comeback might be, yeah, I can still function when I'm upset. And then the last one, I like this one a lot, right? With avoidance behavior. Let's say, you're not doing your work, you're avoiding social activities, you're relying on these safety behaviors to try to calm the emotions. And you might say, this helps me, right? It's good for me to commit to this avoidance behavior. But the problem, as I said before, is we get a little bit of relief. It's short term. It's, it doesn't have a big impact. And long term, we become really committed to those safety behaviors, to those tactics, which isn't helpful. So I like to sort of remind myself, and this is something I say a lot to clients, remember, short-term gain, long-term pain. Feels good in the moment, but long-term, you really don't learn how to work through the difficult emotions, which is so important. Okay, so let's talk about, the first thing that you can do, right? That might be a little different. Realistic and useful thinking. So we already know about the dangers of this sort of biased, distorted, destructive patterns of thinking. Let's think about realistic and useful thinking. So first of all, I encourage people to start out by being really specific about their thoughts, because often, when we have these thoughts related to the emotions, they're not specific. They're really, kind of generalized, like, oh, something awful is going to happen. I can just feel it. Well, that's not very specific. We want to kind of pinpoint the problem. So I find it really helpful to be specific, write down your concerns, really take a look at them. What's going through my mind? Look at them on paper. And it's also helpful to get them out of your mind and onto paper so you don't keep kicking them around mentally. You can just say, they're on the paper. If it's really that important, I can revisit this information later, but let me just get it out and then I can really look at my thinking. Write down your concerns, see if you can refine the ideas, right? So what is this bad thing that I think is going to happen? Will it be a practical setback? Will it be that my anxiety will spike and I don't know if I can handle that? Will it be that I'll be so distracted by my thoughts that I won't be able to focus on anything else? Be really specific, right? Because then you have an opportunity to deal with that potential problem. If you're not specific, it's going to seem like an overwhelming impossibility. And if you have lots of different concerns, rank them. Pick 2 or 3 that are most important to address, and then figure out where to go from there. Then for realistic thinking, you can ask yourself some questions, right? So if you have a thought about, something bad, let's say you're judging yourself in a harsh way. So for example, suppose, you're struggling in a relationship, right? And you think, I'm unlovable. Nobody could love me. So how realistic is that belief? So you might ask yourself, well, how do I know this? What's the evidence, right? How do I know this for sure? Is it because in this one relationship, I'm having some problems? Is that the case for all of the relationships in my life? Have I ever had, an experience that goes against my belief, that suggests that maybe my thinking isn't quite accurate? So how do you know? What's the evidence for the belief? What's the evidence against? You might also kind of reflect on your personal history. What's happened, right, that drives that thinking? Have you had certain setbacks, certain experiences that have influenced that way of thinking? Maybe you're dealing with an upcoming situation that might be difficult. What is known about that situation and what's unknown? And am I having a more difficult time with what I know or what I don't know? Is it the uncertainty that's really difficult here? You might ask yourself, when you're making a prediction that something catastrophic will happen, you can also ask yourself, well, what's the best thing that might happen, right? And here's where we have to be careful about the so-called positive thinking. So the best, the best, the worst, and then finally kind of that middle ground. What's the most likely outcome? What do I think is most likely to happen here? And then finally ask yourself if there are other possibilities. What you believe may not be accurate. There may be other ways of looking at yourself, the situation, other people that might be more reasonable. So give yourself a chance to think about other possibilities. Finally, we want to think about useful thinking. So it's possible, right, that your thinking is accurate. Let's say you got fired from a job, right? And you're thinking, yeah, it's going to be really hard for me to find another job. That might be true, right? So then the question is, what could you do? So here's where you might start to plan a little bit, right? I want to, start looking for jobs, and here's how I'm going to do it. This is my plan. I'm going to reach out to this person who might know somebody and get my resume together, right? So you can prepare yourself. You can take action, or at least get yourself ready for that. You might also remind yourself that useful thinking is going to fall into generally one of 2 categories. There's an opportunity for change, right? I can do something about this. And then there's an opportunity for acceptance. I really did lose my job and it's painful, and I have to accept that, right? That's something I'm just going to have to deal with for a little while. So that can be really helpful to, sorry, my cat. He's very active here. Talk about acceptance, right? I gotta tolerate this bad behavior from my cat. So that can be useful, right? To kind of acknowledge that I've got two general options here, and what do I think I should do? If you've got practical problems, right, eliminate those obstacles. You know, there are different things that you can do to try to prepare yourself for upcoming challenges. And if there's something getting in your way, fix it, address the problem, take these practical steps to make the situation better, and then plan for performance, right? What can you do to increase the likelihood that, you know, things go your way, that you get what you want, that you display behavior that you're really trying to display? And when you plan for success, when you give yourself an opportunity to do something well, and you do, right, you experience success, and it can be a really small win, a small change and improvement, that builds self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is just a belief about your effectiveness. It's about your capacity to do something that's really important. Let's take, for example, somebody who's depressed and they're quite sedentary. They sleep until noon every day. They might say, you know what, I really want to work on getting up. And, you know, for me, it's a big deal to get out of bed by 10 a.m. And, you know, if I just walk around the block, that's an improvement, right? I'm doing something. And so a lot of us might hear that and say, that's not a big deal, right? Anyone could do that, but a lot of people can't, right? If they're struggling with depression. So make a plan, right? Schedule it, figure out how you're going to do this, and then take those small steps, and that builds self-efficacy. The more you do it, the more you believe, hey, I can keep this going, that there's an opportunity to continue this and really build my effectiveness and feel better about what I'm doing. Okay, so realistic and useful thinking, very important. The other thing I like to encourage kind of the next general tactic. By the way, how are we doing on time?
Can you hear me, Joel? I think I hope, I'm not sure if my, hi, I thought I could give a tiny gentle heads up that we have around 10 to 15 minutes. So
Okay.
I just wanted to give a heads up before the discussion session. So whatever you feel like, you know, comfortable. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem. I can do this in 10 to 15 minutes, I think. So the next general tactic, right, when we want to work through difficult emotions, I say, take action, demand satisfaction. Right, remember, behaviorally, a lot of what we do when we're struggling emotionally is avoidance, right? So instead we want to do the opposite, action, not avoidance. So we want to move toward important activities, important tasks, important behaviors. We want to take action. And when I say demand satisfaction, I'm talking about living a satisfying life, prioritizing the things that really give us a sense of meaning and purpose, fulfillment, really letting our values, our long-term values, drive action rather than letting our emotions call the shots. This little cartoon, right, I think it's kind of funny. You know, we all struggle with different things, and some people get really anxious and, you know, kind of simple social interactions like, you know, making a phone call. And so here we have this, you know, this guy who seems to be thinking that other people have this so easy. And if I have to make a call, you know, I really got to gear up for it, and I got to have water, or, you know, maybe it's alcohol, who knows? You know, I got to do all this stuff. And then when I finally get to a point where I've got to make the call, I can't do it, right? That's avoidance. So we want to find ways to work through the emotion and take action and really live in accordance with our values. So when we have avoidance urges, right, one of the things that's really helpful is to recognize them and say, no, I'm not going to act on the avoidance urge. Instead, I'm moving toward the important challenge. I'm going to prioritize value-driven action. We can ask ourselves, what's my priority here? Do I want to manage my emotions, try really hard not to feel a certain way? Or do I want to prioritize living a satisfying life, doing the things that bring pleasure and a sense of accomplishment or mastery? What am I going for here? What's more important? Some of the things we can do is, you know, we have internal arousal, right? We're sweating, muscular tension, the heart's beating fast. We can look at that and say, that's anxiety, I can't function. Or we can say, that internal arousal, that's an opportunity for me. That tells me that I'm taking something seriously. There's a challenge in front of me, and I want to face it. I want to do this thing anyway, even though anxiety is there. That's okay. I can make this happen. As I said before, we make plans for success. How am I going to do this, right? The guy who can't make the call, you know, call a friend first. Call somebody that's safe, somebody you feel comfortable with. Start with small challenges, work your way up to bigger challenges. Invite uncertainty, right? One of the things that's so important is if you're going to prioritize action in your life, that means you got to accept some risks. Doesn't mean being reckless, but when we take on meaningful challenges in life, there's uncertainty. It may not go well. Something bad could happen. We may not be as effective as we like. Can we live with that uncertainty? Because if you're going to live your life, you have to. We deal with uncertainty in all areas of our lives all the time. But for some of us, in some situations, the uncertainty is intolerable. So it really does come down to being willing to accept that uncertainty if you're going to take important risks to do meaningful things in life. So maybe you invite the uncertainty. Come on, uncertainty. I can handle it. I can tolerate this. I can work through it. Let's see what happens, right? I'll take that risk. Take the first step. Start small. You can conduct behavioral experiments. And I really like this idea of behavioral experiments. It's like, the idea that I'm going to do something that's really important, but I think it's not going to go well. And you know what? I'll do it anyway. I'll collect the data and I'll see for myself. Was my prediction accurate, or did I actually do this thing? And then I learned, hey, you know what? My thinking got in my way. I didn't need to rely so much on those beliefs. And then finally, reflect on what you learned. So when you take these meaningful chances, when you prioritize action, what did you learn? I like to say that behavior drives cognition. So a moment ago, I talked about changing your thinking, or at least responding to biased thoughts with directly challenging those ideas. Is there another way to think about this? But the best way to change your thinking is with behavior change, by taking action. So behavior drives cognition. When you move toward a challenge, when you prioritize what's meaningful in your life, you learn firsthand these difficult emotions are temporary. You learn firsthand that, hey, this discomfort is tolerable. I can work through it. And then you also learn that these thoughts that I had, about my effectiveness or my worth or whatever, they're not factual, right? Or maybe they're not. So it gives you a chance to revise your thinking once you finally take action. Okay, next, and then the final tactic is more acceptance-based, right? Learning how to accept and tolerate and relate differently to these difficult emotions. So here I want to introduce the concept of STUF, and I use the acronym STUF, S-T-U-F, just one F. And people hear this and I ask them, notice your stuff and ask yourself, what do you want to do with your stuff? And people think about getting their stuff from Amazon. And I say, no, it's about your stuff. That's your inner experience. So STUF, S, these are your sensations. That's what your body's doing. T, your thoughts. This is what you're thinking, the cognitive process. U, your urges, what you want to do, avoidance, or not do, right? Also might be avoidance. And then the feeling labels. What do you call all of this? Do you call it, I'm uncomfortable, or do you say, I'm freaking out, I'm panicked, right? Very different. So the way we describe our inner experience is important. When you notice your stuff, you can look at the interplay. How do my sensations, thoughts, urges, and feeling labels influence each other? And how do I make sense of all of this? For most of us, we notice our stuff, maybe we notice one or two things, what my body's doing, what I'm thinking, and then immediately we go to what we've turned to repeatedly in the past, which is some form of avoidance, but we have options. We can do different things. So we can accept and redirect. We can practice observing the 4 parts of emotions. Notice your stuff. See if you can remain non-judgmental. These are just feelings. I don't have to look at them as bad or problematic. It's just what I'm experiencing. See if you can remain oriented to the present instead of looking at the past and all the setbacks, looking at the future and all of the anxiety-provoking challenges. What's going on right now? What are you dealing with in the moment emotionally? And then what do you want to do about it? And that's the next step. Make a choice about how to respond. And as I said before, do you make a change your thinking, change your behavior? Or do you accept, right? You say, yeah, this is how I feel, and that's okay. And then accept and redirect, right? You redirect your attention. I notice my emotion. Now I want to think about what's more important. Or you redirect your behavior. Now I want to do something different. Accept and redirect, a useful mantra. So some examples of accept the authentic inner experience, accept your stuff. 4 ways you can do this. You can be objective. It's just a thought. I don't need to take it seriously. It's just internal arousal. It's not dangerous. It's harmless. You can tolerate it. You can understand your inner experience, your stuff as an annoyance. I like to use the example of spam email. You don't open every email, the spam, and say, oh, I really need to read this carefully. You say, this is noise, this is nonsense. I'm done with it. I'm not going to spend time on it. You don't like it. It's annoying. It interferes with your functioning, but it's harmless. So you can tolerate your stuff. You can use some humor, a little sarcasm, right? Oh, thanks, brain. You're keeping me safe. I really appreciate that, even though you don't. A little inside humor. When my heart's beating fast, I like to imagine that it's beating to the rhythm of a song I really like, or even better, a song I can't stand. It makes me laugh a little bit. A little warmth, a little self-compassion, right? You notice your stuff and you remind yourself it's okay to have feelings. I want to treat myself the way I would treat a friend. I want to be patient with myself. I want to respond with warmth. And then redirect, right? So you've noticed it, you acknowledge it, you accept it, redirect your attention. What would you rather be doing in the moment? You can do the realistic and useful thinking, as I mentioned. You can take action, demand satisfaction. You can bring your attention to what's truly important in the moment, or you can really prioritize that value-driven behavior. My emotions aren't going to control me. My values are going to dictate what I do here. Let me wrap it up with a recap of all of this. So overview, we want to consider the interplay of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, right? This gives us an opportunity to know what we're working with and figure out where to go from there. We want to remember that we can't always avoid or control our difficult emotions. We're going to have challenges in life. Things will test us. We're going to feel it, and that's okay. When we feel these emotions, we can make a choice for action over avoidance. One way we can take action is notice our thinking traps and respond with more realistic and useful ways of thinking. Another way we can take action is we can work through the emotions and really prioritize our values and our value-driven behavior and get on with our lives. Another way we can take action is we can accept and redirect. I have these feelings, I can relate to them objectively, I can tolerate the annoyance, I can use a little humor, I can have some self-compassion. I can accept this, and then I'm going to redirect, and I'm going to focus on more important things. I'm going to focus on how I want to live my life. Taking action, big picture, really helps us learn about the difficult emotions we experience. And again, taking action, it can be cognitive, it can be behavioral. So we learn a lot about the emotions, and we learn a lot about our ability to cope whenever we prioritize action over avoidance. How'd I do on time? You good?
Perfectly on time.
Okay. All right. Sorry to
Thank you
rush
so
a
much.
little bit at the end there.
Yeah, that was great. And that was a lovely presentation, Joel. Is there a possibility I could request you to stop sharing and we can, start the discussion session then?
Sure. Let's see. Did I do that right?
Just not yet. I do think you'll have to press it again. Click the button again.
Should I press the stop presenting? Is that the?
It didn't stop yet. So is there a possibility you can press it again and see? Do you think that might work?
I just want to make sure it says stop presenting, but then it says this will end the presentation.
Let me see if there's. I don't think I can. Okay, wait. Okay, I think this should work even if we have that, right? So you're spotlighted for everyone now.
Okay.
So that was a great presentation, and I think you really touched upon a lot of issues for both students and even for us in everyday life. So thank you so much for that. And before I begin yet again, I want to thank my wonderful class. I'm really proud of them, and a lot of them are here, and they have come up with great questions to ask you. And so I welcome everyone to either raise your hand or you can put your questions in the chat as well, and you can take a minute. It's 10:29. We can just take a minute and you can put your questions in and we can get to the discussion session then. Okay, so I have two questions from Palak. Okay, just give me a second. Joel, do you want to, is it all right? Can we just get directly into the discussion session, or do you want to take a 1 minute break? It's fine.
No, I'm good. I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, so the first question is by Palak. She says that I have two questions. Okay, many questions are coming together. Okay, first is about neuroscientific way of dealing with mental disorders. And second is about the way you relate to your clients. So the first is, the question is, there is this idea that if we can come up with this completed neuroscience and we would be able to say trace every neuron, we will be able to treat mental disorders because we would sort of know all the neural networks which underlie them. So what do you think about this? Do you think that that's something that's possible?
Well, neuroscience isn't my area, so I probably wouldn't be able to, answer that with any degree of credibility. But I guess my take on that is, it's a nice idea, right? It would be wonderful if we had the capacity to really understand, how the brain functions to that degree. But my sense is, it's that there's so much variability in the way people experience certain emotional challenges, and so. I guess one of my issues with that is, it sort of suggests that perhaps medical treatment is going to be the way here if people are struggling emotionally. And with something like that, let's say, for example, we're thinking about, somebody who they've been married for 30 years and their spouse dies, right? It's, a major life event and they're depressed. This is not a medical issue. This is not a problem with the brain. They're dealing with loss and it's going to be painful for a while. And so, I guess from my perspective, this is not, how do you understand what's going on in the brain and treat the brain. I think it's important to develop other tactics for dealing with the emotional impact of that loss. It's not a medical issue. So that's sort of my take on this. But, as far as kind of addressing, advances in neuroscience that might help us kind of understand exactly what's going on in the brain when people struggle emotionally, I wouldn't be able to provide much useful information there.
So the second question she had is, when you're treating your clients, is there a possibility that the coping mechanisms that they do come up with, they themselves cause problems and they become only sources of like instant gratification instead of long-term gradual development of healthy behaviors? Like, have you seen this happen?
Well, it happens all the time, right? And these are, sort of the subtle things that I was talking about with avoidance, where, sometimes some of these, it's really tricky because sometimes the coping strategies that we use can be really helpful in some conditions and not others. So, for example, let's say you were gonna, you had anxiety about taking a flight. You might do research on how often do planes go down and how safe is it? And are there, emergency procedures in place when you fly? And so somebody might say, you know what, there's less than 1% chance that something awful will happen. I'll take the risk, I'll get on the flight. But the same person, they might be troubled by, let's say they're thinking my partner isn't loyal, they're cheating on me, I can't trust them. And they tell me everything's okay. And I track them, I follow them, and I don't believe them. And, there's all this uncertainty, and probability is not going to be good enough for them. They're not going to say I think it's okay, I think it's good. They're going to be dealing with, an intolerance of uncertainty in that context. And so working really hard to collect more information to feel safe is probably going to backfire. It becomes kind of a reassurance seeking that's never going to be completely satisfying. So I think it's really important for people to explore a variety of tactics for dealing with difficult emotions, because if you just find one thing and you stick with that, it can become very easy to be dependent on that tactic and then to struggle emotionally when it doesn't work or it's no longer as effective as it used to be. I'm not sure if that answered the question. If there's more to it, please let me know.
So in case anyone has follow-up, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can also raise your hand, of course. So the next question is by Pranav. So Pranav asked that anxiety is, as you have discussed, a very complex emotion, and many people deal with it in different ways. So I would like to ask you a question about anxiety as it features in student life with relation to procrastination, especially during exam time. So when we procrastinate studying for an exam, while we are procrastinating and doing something else, like say surfing on Insta or maybe watching something, we are feeling anxious. We understand this is detrimental for us, but we still continue to not study. So why does that happen? And is it something that's related to delayed gratification, like feeling in the last moment that we have done so much? Also, how should we address this? What should we do if we are in the process of procrastination? How can we also avoid it?
Okay, these are great questions. Well, yeah, I think there is sort of a subtle instant gratification because you know, I mean, think about what's happening. If you say, I'm not going to do this work, right, because I'm anxious about it, and then you don't do the work, then you experience a decline in anxiety because you don't have to deal with this difficult thing of preparing or studying or doing the work. So there's kind of a reinforcement of that procrastination because the anxiety declines, you get a little bit of relief. And then, right, when you commit to another behavior, like I'm going to get on Instagram, then you might also experience reinforcement for that because, you know, it's stimulating, you get some enjoyment, you might see what your friends are doing. And so, you know, you're kind of reinforced for avoiding the work and also reinforced for doing something else that's kind of fun and enjoyable. And so we get so focused, it was like I was saying before, short-term gain, long-term pain. We get so focused on those immediate consequences of our choices that we lose sight of the big picture. So this is what I was referencing earlier when I was talking about prioritizing your values. If you're thinking, hey, you know, it's important for me to do well in school and I'm going to feel anxious because this is hard stuff and it's, you know, kind of big stakes here and I want to do well and get good grades and all of that, or maybe you want to go to grad school, whatever. You got to find a way to make that happen, right? Even if you feel anxious. So if you can acknowledge, right, that this is an anxiety provoking thing for me and I'd rather procrastinate, but then you make the commitment to do it anyway. And you say, I'm going to schedule some time for studying. I'm going to be consistent about it. I'll do, you know, a small amount, the smallest amount that I still consider to be meaningful. I'll do it every day. I'll do it multiple times a day. And if you do this, even when you're feeling anxious, with practice, with experience, it becomes much easier to work through the emotion. And then you see for yourself that, hey, I overall, big picture, I feel better, I function better, and I have more realistic and useful beliefs about myself and my ability to do this work when I really commit to doing it, even when I have the urge not to.
Right. This next question is, I also wanted to get your opinion about a myth which is generally there around mental health. So Pranav has often heard that the idea that mental illnesses or disorders might be luxuries for those who belong to economically well-off and upper class. So have you heard something of this sort? It says that people who are underprivileged and they're busy trying to survive and they cannot really afford to get therapy, while the rich ones are those who actually acknowledge mental health and go forward with managing it. So have you heard something of the sort?
I've heard that. That's a tough question to answer. I don't know if I can give you a solid answer there. I guess, you know, the way I see it is that we all experience intense and difficult emotions. That's a part of life. And I see the point, right? I see the argument that, you know, for people who, you know, maybe they just don't have the opportunity to, you know, get wrapped up in their thoughts and feelings. They just kind of have to let that inner experience be there because their life is so stressful, it's so challenging. They have to work, they have to keep going, they have to keep moving forward, you know, to get through all of the stressful events that are coming their way. And maybe they don't have the opportunity for therapy. You know, I see the argument, right, that perhaps for some folks, you know, they're just so focused on surviving and getting through life that, you know, the inner experience becomes less of a priority. But certainly, you know, it's the case where people, you know, they live in poverty, they have a lot of, they're exposed to a lot of stressful life events, and there are emotional disturbances, you know, that affect them. And of course, without access to therapy or some sort of professional support, they struggle even more. So I don't think I could say that, you know, we're going to see more of this in one type of economic group versus another. I see the point, but I think there's so much there's so much variability from across individuals that it's hard to kind of group people in that way and come to a firm conclusion. So I guess my big picture answer to that is I think, you know, all kinds of people are at risk for dealing with emotional disturbances.
Right. So I think that leads us quite well into the next question, because I think in the context of talking about someone who's emotionally intelligent, we usually use this category. So Darsh is asking, do you feel that the idea of emotional intelligence is a good one? So in case of IQ tests, which has many criticisms, would say that there is no standard for what it means to be intelligent. So there is no clear-cut idea, the criteria that can be used. So search tests for IQ were also criticized for being socially biased towards dominant groups often. So many a times I have come across emotional intelligence tests which tries to categorize people. So is it possible to talk about judging people's capacities to respond to the situation in this way? Do you feel that there could be, say, a bias towards neurotypicals?
Let's see, there are a lot of questions embedded in there. So if I'm missing something, let me know. But I guess, first of all, the concept of intelligence, this is controversial. And my perspective is, when we use the term intelligence, that really refers to a specific collection of cognitive abilities, or primarily cognitive abilities. And so we really do know a lot about intelligence. And I do understand the argument that we have to be careful about, the way we assess intelligence and the way we interpret intelligence test score data. We have to consider, the background of the individual, their life experiences, their schooling. All of these factors are going to be important to consider when we're making sense of these IQ test scores. But really, intelligence, these intelligence tests, they're sophisticated, they're well developed. They're standardized instruments that have so much research support behind them, and and what we're really looking at is generally a diverse collection of cognitive abilities. That's what intelligence is, and I think a responsible examiner is going to be able to go beyond an IQ test score, beyond the test scatter that we see across the subtests, to really understand what the experiences of the individual and how those experiences might have influenced the test scores, and that it may not be a pure measure of ability or potential, that there are lots of things that might affect performance. Now, the second part of this idea of emotional intelligence, I think a lot of psychologists would object to or dismiss this concept. I want to be clear about this. As I said before, intelligence, right? It's primarily cognitive. So when we're talking about something like, somebody's emotional responsivity, their capacity to understand emotions, work through them, relate to them in useful ways, to act on the emotions in productive ways. I get that when people talk about emotional intelligence, these are the things that they're thinking about. And I look at that as not intelligence, but perhaps, I don't know, maybe we use different terms, because I think it's important to be careful about how we use intelligence. But it might be somebody's, capacity for emotional expression, or their ability to tolerate distress or other difficult emotions. So it's not intelligence, but I think people have different emotional skills or capacities, strengths and limitations. We vary with regard to our ability to understand emotions, to use emotions, to manage emotions. So I think that those abilities do differ, but I certainly wouldn't call that an aspect of intelligence.
Okay. Okay, so Rishi has the next question. Rishi asks, in our society, accepting that someone has a mental illness and that the person is still worthy of being considered rational is in itself a distant dream. So usually those who go to a therapist or suffer from mental disorder do not even share it with their families. So also there is the added dimension that as a man, we also have the whole toxic masculinity thing. So in case I feel that there is a friend who's a male friend who's suffering from depression, how should I approach him while keeping in mind these stigmas?
I'm sorry, I may have missed some of that question. Is the main element here that it's difficult for people who have a mental illness or an emotional disturbance to kind of reveal this to other people?
Yes.
And so if you notice this in someone, how do you approach them? How do you deal with that?
Yes, and there's also the part about that, the fact that men are usually supposed to not have, emotions. They're supposed to be people, and we usually don't consider people who have mental disorders to be rational at all. So I think he has mentioned 3 points: that how do we deal with these stigmas? How can he help a friend and approach him if he's suffering from depression or anxiety?
Okay. Well, dealing with stigma, I mean, this is sort of sort of a societal issue, I guess. And so it goes beyond how do I deal with a friend or a family member who's struggling. So I'll focus more on that part of it. This is such a tough thing, and it really depends on the individual. And, we have to be careful about the way we approach people, because, if you ask somebody, hey, point out, I've noticed that, you seem to be down, or things seem to be difficult for you. I've noticed, emotionally there seems to be a difference, or, this is happening. I've observed the behavior and I'm just concerned about you. They might become very defensive. They might say, leave me alone, nothing's wrong. I don't even believe in this concept of mental illness. I mean, you might get that kind of reaction. So, it really does depend on the individual. I think, kind of a gentle way of exploring this. How you doing? Is everything okay with you? You seem like you might be a little down, and if it's pretty clear that they don't want to talk about it, maybe letting them know that, hey, sometimes things get difficult, and if you ever want somebody to talk to, I'm here to help you, and and they might be open to sharing more information with you. But I think if you push people, to get them to reveal what's going on, or if you try to encourage them to get professional help, sometimes folks will get defensive. They're not open to getting that feedback. So it really is delicate. I wish I could kind of give you, some clear guidelines for how to handle this, but I would say tread lightly. Don't try to push it too hard, and get a feel for whether somebody's really open to, revealing their challenges with you. And if they're not, probably best just to demonstrate that I'm supportive, I care about you, I'm here for you. If you need anything, let me know, and let them make the call on their own terms.
Okay, so I hope that was useful, Rishi. And so Aman has asked, what are the ways in which using social media networks like Facebook or Instagram could make someone anxious? Also, usually in response to such issues, the response to such issues is to say no to social media, or to suggest moderate usage, or to sort of admit that, okay, it is inevitable, we are going to face such issues. So what do you think is the right way to respond to anxiety driven by social media, especially during the pandemic situation, I guess?
But I guess it depends on what the anxiety is about. So, like, if somebody looks at social media and then they get anxious because, I don't know, maybe they think their life isn't as exciting or enjoyable as somebody else's, and then they have to see these people and they have to kind of act like they're really upbeat and happy. They have to kind of create this image. They're anxious about that. I mean, that's a possibility. I guess people can be anxious about all kinds of things. So it really sort of depends on what is it about social media that is anxiety provoking. Are you willing to, is there
specific thing? Okay, so Aman, you can think about that if there's anything specific, and you can share if you want.
It'd be easier for me to answer that, I think, if you pointed out something specific that somebody might be anxious about.
Sure. So Aman, you can just think about it, and you can just let us know if there's anything you would specifically like to ask, right? So next is by Amit, and Amit is saying, what do you feel is the relation between intolerance for uncertainty and anxiety? Like, what are your views? What is the relation between them?
There's such a strong relationship. I think it's so important to be aware of that link. And I find, in working with folks with a variety of anxiety disorders, intolerance of uncertainty is so central to so many anxiety disorders. So, for example, somebody with generalized anxiety might worry about so many different things, and and until they can know for sure, right, that they can get to the bottom of these worries, they're not going to stop exploring the possibilities. Somebody with panic disorder might be uncertain about whether they're going to have a panic attack. They need to know for sure, I'm going to be safe. I'm not going to have this embarrassing experience, or I'm not going to have this medical event if I go out in public. I've got to know, I have to have that certainty. Somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder might, that's really key in OCD. The uncertainty, if I, for example, if somebody has a contamination concern, if I, touch something that's dirty, will I get contaminated? Will it be safe? Will I spread this contaminant? And so, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a little here. And so intolerance of uncertainty, it really is an element in all aspects of anxiety. And so I think, as I was saying before in the talk, so important for people to get to a point where they can say, I'm not going to be able to get all the answers. I just won't. I want certainty. I want it so bad, but I just can't get there. Can I live with a reasonable amount of uncertainty and get on with my life? And that's so important. And if you can't do that, right, then you get stuck. And the only option is to commit to avoidance and excessive safety behaviors. And I think most people, no matter how hard they work at that, they eventually get to a point where they say, I can't keep doing this. I can't operate that way. It's not good for me. I need to find a way to work through it.
Right. So Shrujna has the next question. During the pandemic situation, what has been your experience with handling cases of mental isolation? So what are the different aspects that might arise for someone who is mentally isolated? Given that there is lockdown and we all couldn't really meet each other much, do you feel that the digital has the capacity to support human beings like physical support?
I'm sorry, something about digital.
Yeah, so is there a capacity for the digital to help support us like physical support? So there's a comparison that can we really look for the kind of support that we get digitally, just like we get physically? Like, what would be the difference?
Well, good question. I think, by necessity, right, because a lot of us are isolated, we've kind of turned to virtual communication. And I think most people would say it's just not as good. It's not as fulfilling. It's not as rewarding to have this, kind of virtual interaction with folks, or at least primarily virtual. And, we do what we can. I think we're limited in our opportunities. And so that's kind of a creative way of doing things. And, I know like when people are used to kind of meeting their friends and having cocktails or something, they have, it seems kind of corny, but let's do a, virtual cocktail hour. I know a lot of people who went months, right? I won't do it. It's silly. I won't get anything out of it. Then they try it and they say, it's better than isolating myself even more. So I think there's value, right, in connecting with people in creative ways. I think we can benefit from, through video communication and electronic, texting and messaging and all of that. But, it's not going to take the place of in-person contact or interaction. I think that's so important for most people. Now, I have noticed that, some people who really struggle with social anxiety, they're sort of feeling kind of some relief or a sense of security. It's like I don't have to be so on or so effective in my interactions with people face to face because I've got a screen. I can be at home. I'm in a safe place. So I think for people with anxiety disorders, one of the problems is there's kind of this false sense that, it's easier for me to deal with social challenges. But at a certain point, once we're all kind of back out there in the world and interacting with folks and in person, people who've really isolated themselves intentionally, to try to minimize anxiety, they're going to have a tough time adjusting.
Right. So before I get to the other questions, I want to say that we have around 5 minutes left, guys. So I have it's a night on Joel's side. So I told him. So I will share the details. You can drop him a mail in case you feel like asking him a question. I'll just go through next 2-3 questions and then we'll have to do a bye, right? So okay, we have the next question by Varinia. She asked, over the years, I have noticed that there is a different way of dealing with situations where you just focus on the pragmatic side of the situation. So perhaps you only look at the consequences of an action and you're not really emotionally affected by things around you. Do you feel that's all right? Is that abnormal or is it normal? And
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I just want to make sure I'm following.
So the question is that, Varinia, you can also speak, if you want, you can also share your version of this, right? So I'll just say, Varinia says that over the years, I have noticed that there is a different way of dealing with situations where you just focus on the pragmatic side of the situation. You just look at the consequences and you're not affected emotionally by the things that happen around you. So is that all right? Is that something that's normal or it's abnormal? She's mentioned that.
Is this question, is this person speaking about themselves, that this is something they've noticed in their own life, that they're not as focused on emotions, or just in general, that this is how people seem to operate?
So, Varini, are you here? I might have to call you. If in case you're here, you can come on, or else, you can also put it in the chat if you want. I have a shy group of kids. Um, okay, so just think about it. If this is your own experience, or is this something that is someone else is going through, so you can just share that. And meanwhile, I'm just going to get to the next one. Wait, let me just check if she's here. I'm not sure if she might be here. Okay, but that's all right. I don't like people putting people on spot, so I try not to call people on very specifically. Okay, Varini has written in general, professor. So she
Okay.
says in general, like.
I don't know. I guess that's a tough question to answer. I deal with individuals, so it's hard for me to kind of make these generalizations, but people are so different, right? Some people, I guess a big part of my talk today was on, how people are so aware of their emotional experiences. And, because of the intensity of the emotion, they lean toward avoidance, they move toward that type of responding. I guess, a lot of people, who focus on kind of pragmatic behavior change, there's certain things I need to do. I got to find a way to get it done. I find that, some people, maybe they don't struggle so much emotionally when they're, more focused on the behavior. I find that some people, they say it's important for me to get certain things done, and I get emotional while doing it, and I learn to deal with it. And then I find that some people, they're really good about taking action, and they say, they don't struggle emotionally, but then at a certain point, they might start to realize that their emotions kind of catch up to them. So sometimes I'll get therapy clients, and they'll say, for years I didn't have any kind of emotional distress. I would just go, 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 go. I had a high pressure job. I was just all about action and pragmatism. And then I don't know what happened, right? All of a sudden I kind of got to a point where I got emotionally overwhelmed. It's something new for me. I've never experienced it, and then they really struggle. So I think there's quite a bit of variability there in the way people experience difficult emotions and the way they cope with them.
Okay, so the next question is by Vanshika. In your presentation, you talked about how we tend to sort of avoid our emotions and sort of sweep them under the rug. We also tend to pick up on how to respond to our emotions often through our environment as children. So given that such ways of responding are so embedded in us, to what extent can we make changes to it? Like I have heard with dogs, and for training them, if there are dogs who are genetically emotionally reactive, then we cannot remove that behavior, or we cannot change the way in which we can only manage the behavior. We cannot eliminate a behavior in an emotionally reactive dog. Do you feel that it is that way with us as well?
What a great question. I think it's important to separate, right? We have the emotional reactions, right? And that's the stuff, right? So there are going to be, these are conditioned responses in many cases. And like you said, right, early experiences throughout our lives, we have, sort of events, that kind of lead to certain types of emotional reactions, certain ways of thinking, and it becomes almost automatic, almost like a reflex. And so these emotions, they just kind of occur. And so a lot of people, they want to change how they feel and how they think. And I think you're right that when these, kind of patterns of responding become kind of habitual, they start to become pretty fixed. And so I think this is such an important concept. Let's take anxiety, for example. Like when I was a little kid, there was, in my neighborhood, there was a dog that was usually on a leash, and I was kind of fearful of dogs, but one day the dog was off the leash, and the dog got really close to me, and it was a big dog, and he was scary, and I had, that fear reaction. And because of that one experience, that one interaction with the dog, for years when I encountered dogs, to this day, right, I see dogs, and even little dogs, right, I hear them bark or they run toward me, I flinch. I have an emotional reaction. I think it's a learned response. I didn't get rid of that. I've been around a lot of dogs. I like dogs now, but I still have that emotional reaction. I still detect danger when I encounter a dog. And so I think it's really important to understand that when you've learned that way of thinking, that way of emotional responding, you've learned the avoidance urge, these are well-rehearsed responses. You don't control that. But here's the important element, right? What we do have control over is our response to it. So we can feel anxious. We can have certain thoughts that maybe aren't very rational. We can have these avoidance urges, but using the tactics that I've mentioned today, we have a comeback, right? We can say, no, this is what I want to remember about this. Here's another way of thinking about this. I can allow these thoughts and feelings to exist, and I can also create some new ideas. There's a capacity for new learning here. I can establish a different emotional response, a different way of thinking, and then most important, I can display a different behavior. So here's where we get back to taking action. I can feel anxious and I can move towards something that's difficult. I don't get rid of that feeling, right? Or maybe it declines a little bit, maybe becomes less frequent, less intense, but it doesn't go away entirely. I've learned that already. But I can learn a new way of understanding the challenge, a new emotional reaction, and I can learn new patterns of behavior that boost that self-efficacy, that indicate to me that, hey, I can handle this. I don't have to act on the anxiety. I can tolerate the emotion. I can be effective. I can work through this. I can live. So it's about new learning, right? It's not about eliminating the emotions. It's about learning something new so that you give yourself an opportunity to grow, to move, to improve, and to get on with your life. So we don't extinguish it, the emotions, but we do learn new things so that we can pivot and adjust and make things better.
Right. Okay. So it's exactly 11 on our side, and I think it must be 10 on your side, Joel. And so I thank you so much, Joel, for joining us. You guys can reach out to Joel by mail and ask him doubts as well. I just shared it on the chat here, so you guys can feel free to do that. And I think we had a great session, and thank you so much for being here, Joel. And I'll just send you the recording soon once we have it ready for you.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed speaking with you all. I wish I could see everybody. These are wonderful questions, very, very thoughtful questions. So thank you so much for being engaged, and I really enjoyed it. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Joel. Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Bye, guys.